Good morning, friends. We are going to get started on lesson 6. Yesterday, we finished up our lesson about the Mojave. We talked a lot about how it was a hot desert, a hot and dry desert. Now, our next few lessons are going to focus on the Great Basin Desert, which makes up a lot more of Utah than the Mojave does. Now, the Great Basin is a cold desert, so we're going to be switching gears quite a bit in talking about what makes this a cold desert. Now, hopefully, if you have your maps at home or your notebook at home, you should be recognizing this map that we did. Before, we talked about the Chihuahuan, the Sonoran, and the Mojave. Now, today, we're going to read through the last of these three, the Colorado Plateau, the Great Basin Desert, and the Great Plains. So, we've already talked about the Chihuahuan just a little. We've talked about the Sonoran a little. We spent a lot of time on the Mojave. Now, we are going to talk about mostly today that Great Basin, but we also need to recognize what these two are as well. So, let's go ahead and let's go down to where we can read about this. The Colorado Plateau Desert, a high, semi-arid region between the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountains in the Four Corners region, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Much of the region is covered by pinyon pine and juniper shrub forests. All right, so that Colorado Plateau. Let's take a different color. We're going to make it really small there. We're going to make that pink. We're going to outline about where it is. So you can see it makes up quite a bit of Utah, because if we color in our Utah shape, from what we can see, that is a lot of Utah that is taken up by the Colorado Plateau Desert. Now, what about the Great Basin? It says the northern 3/4 of Nevada, western and southern Utah, to the southern third of Idaho and the southeastern corner of Oregon. According to some, it also includes some small portions of western Colorado and southwestern Wyoming. It is bordered on the south by the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. Oop, didn't want to go that far. So looking at the Great Basin, let's change colors one more time. This time I'm going to use a yellow. The Great Basin technically goes along these same lines, and it's quite large. Here we have Idaho, we have Oregon, we have Nevada over here. It's a pretty large area, isn't it? Pretty crazy. And it just erased my yellow of that one. We'll redo that really fast. I want you to take a look at this while I'm recoloring that. That is such a large area. Now, in comparison to the Chihuahuan, we heard the other day that Chihuahuan was the largest desert in North America. Why does the Great Basin look so much bigger if it's technically smaller? Just a question we'll keep thinking about. Now let's talk about our Great Plains. The Great Plains are a high, semi-arid grassland or steppe region in the rain shadow area of the Rocky Mountains, extending from central Canada to central Texas. So it says that it's a grassland. Knowing what I know about deserts, do deserts have grass? Are they a grassland kind of a thing? Not really. However, we do want to include it because it could be quite dry. It could have some similarities as to other deserts. So we are going to include it, however, we won't focus on it. Okay, let's keep going. Our learning target for today is that we can dig deeper by annotating the scientific text in order to better understand the gist or main idea of the text. Now, I want you to try to remember what annotating and gist means. What do those two words mean? Pause and think about it. Come back when you're ready. Hopefully, you said that annotating is that we make notes about something. We take notes in the text. So as we're reading, we might be highlighting, we might be drawing a little star to tell us that something's important. We might be circling a word because we don't know what it means. That is annotating. Now, what about the gist? The gist is the main idea of the text, and I tried to limit it to 10 to 15 words. Now, let's go ahead and let's look at our annotating chart so that we can remember how to use it. I want you to pause and think about these 3 questions. What are the different parts of this chart for? What do the symbols help us to do? And why do we annotate while we read? Pause and think about those questions. Come back when you're ready. Now, hopefully you said that, especially for this numbering part, when we number each paragraph, it helps us to understand between friends. If you're all reading the same passage and someone says, oh, look at paragraph number 4. Well, if I've numbered my paragraphs the same way that you've numbered your paragraphs, we're both going to be reading the same paragraph. However, if I number my paragraphs and you don't number your paragraphs, you're going to be having to count each specific one to get down to the one that you want, and then you might not even get the same one. Another important symbol is our little star. Now, normally in class, we just use a regular little star like that. Here you can use an asterisk. That is what that is called. And that's okay too. That's going to let us know that we have found an important detail that should be included in whatever summary we find, whatever summary we do. Now, we're going to sometimes underline key details. Those are going to help us. If it's more than just a key word, we're going to underline it. To help us when we see unknown words, we are going to put a circle around them so that we can come back to them and find them easier later. When it comes to our important words, so not just key details, key sentences, but important vocabulary words, we're going to put a box around them so that I know that that is an important word. If I see something that I don't quite understand as a whole phrase or as a paragraph, I might put a question mark next to it so that I can say, I might need to revisit this when I am, getting ready to reread. I need to see if the rest of this paragraph makes sense as I go on. Maybe I'll find something to make sense of it later. But using that question mark is going to help me to know where I found myself to be confused. Then we have our exclamation point. This is for when we see something that is either surprising or we think this is new information. So if we've read a whole bunch of articles about the same topic and now suddenly we're finding a new fact, we might use an exclamation point. Now finally, you can use words and comments. Like, I'm thinking that this desert must be cold, or this desert must be hot, or in comparison to blank, this is how it goes. And so when I use words and comments, those are going to be more specific to what it is that I'm reading, and they're going to help me to understand even further. So hopefully we answered those questions in our pause and think, and let's get ready to read. Now, another one is that we can find the meanings of unfamiliar words to help us better understand the article, the cold desert, Utah's Great Basin. We are going to make some annotations as we go about what we notice and wonder about the article, as well as identifying those unknown words. Now, if you are at home and you have your workbook, please turn to page 25 And I will read this article out loud for you. You will need to be reading with a pencil or with your finger. Make sure that you're following along. If you do have this at home, circle words that you don't understand, put a question mark by things that you need clarification on. Be sure that you are following along. If you do not have your Desert Environments notebook home with you, make sure that you're following along still. Have a piece of paper nearby so that you can write down the words that you're not sure of, because you will need to be sure of them later. So if you need to go get a paper, pause really quick, go get that paper and a pencil, and then come back. The cold desert, Utah's Great Basin. A land of sagebrushes, salt bushes, hot summers, and freezing winters. The Great Basin Desert covers a wide expanse. In Utah, it extends from the edge of the Mojave Desert near St. George north to Idaho, and from the Wasatch Range west to Nevada. In all, the Great Basin Desert occupies almost 160,000 square miles, including the southern half of Idaho, the southeastern corner of Oregon, and the northern three-fourths of Nevada. It is the largest desert area in the United States. I'm going to put a question mark right there. We'll talk about it later. The Great Basin Desert is considered cold because it receives most of its precipitation in the forms of snow, and because it has low average annual temperatures. It is the northernmost desert in the United States and has base elevations that generally exceed 4,000 feet. Mountain peaks encircled by the Great Basin Desert often exceed 12,000 feet. On the average, temperatures in the Great Basin are more moderate than those in other deserts. In Wendover, with an elevation of 4,237 feet, summers can record high temperatures over 100 degrees, but generally average about 80 degrees. Average winter temperatures, on the other hand, fall just below freezing. Although the Great Basin has fewer plant and animal species than the Mojave Desert, the species found here are well adapted to this unique desert ecosystem. Here you don't find the variations in cacti or yucca that you find in the Mojave, and you don't find as many native annual plants or native trees and shrubs along riparian areas or washes. But you do find plants and animals that are specific to slight differences in environmental conditions. For example, the sagebrush communities that cover miles and miles of Great Basin landscape include over 10 species of sagebrush, and their distribution corresponds to slight variation in rainfall, temperature, and soil. Where soils become salty, sagebrush gives way to salt-tolerant species like saltbrushes. Although the Great Basin is a cold desert and the Mojave is a hot desert, plants and animals face similar environmental challenges. In both areas, the plants and animals have to survive with a limited supply of water and through periods of intense heat. Therefore, when you study the plants and animals of these different deserts, you find that many have similar structural and behavioral adaptations. Coming down here. The Great Basin Desert Ecosystems, which is just outside the back door for many of us, invites us to investigate it. For example, in the spring, find the sage grouse and listen to the male's drum. Explore the relationship between sage grouse and sagebrush. Look for the mounds of harvester ants, which sometimes cover up to 15% of some desert areas in northern Utah. And look for spiders, which in some desert shrub communities may include 20 to 40 species. Listen for the Great Basin spadefoot toad, which emerges from its burrow when vibrations of raindrops alert it to the availability of water. And during the day, watch the western whiptail lizard. Two other reptiles often seen are the Great Basin gopher snake, a non-venomous snake sometimes called the blow snake, and the Great Basin rattlesnake, the only venomous snake in the area. Finally, always be on the lookout for badgers, antelope, kangaroo rats, kit foxes, bobcats, black-tailed jackrabbits, and coyotes. Okay, now that I have read that article, what do you think this article is mostly about? Now, I want you to try to formulate a gist statement and write it in the upper margin of the article. To go ahead and pause. When you're ready, come back. Okay, so in my mind, the gist or the main idea of this passage is that the Great Basin is a cold desert in Utah. Hopefully you have something similar. If not, hopefully it still makes sense, is what you have, the main idea of the entire passage. Now, counting my words, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I am super close. Remember, our key is that we want to be 10 to 15. I have 16. That is close enough. That is a good gist. Now, just like we did in lesson 4 with the Mojave, we are going to do a second read in which we're going to dig deeper and mark up the text. Now, I've already started numbering the paragraphs. If you have this article at home, go ahead and grab a crayon or a highlighter to help you identify where the paragraphs start and end. Make sure that you have the first page looking something like this. You do not need to use the same colors. If you do have those same colors, it might be helpful, but make sure that you have a different color for each paragraph on this page. Go ahead and pause, and then I will show you how to do the next page and we will get started. Here's that next page for you. Now you'll notice that my top paragraph is the same as my last paragraph on the other page. There are only 5 paragraphs. It just so happens that number 3 is so long that it has to start at the bottom of page 1 or of the first page, and it goes up to the top of the second page. But they are indeed the same part of the same paragraph. So make sure that you have your top paragraph on the second page labeled as the bottom paragraph as the first page. Okay, let's go ahead and let's read our first paragraph. It should look something like this when you have your notebook all the way open. A land of sagebrushes, salt bushes, hot summers, and freezing winters, the Great Basin Desert covers a wide expanse. In Utah, it extends from the edge of the Mojave Desert near St. George, north to Idaho, and from the Wasatch Range west to Nevada. In all, the Great Basin Desert occupies almost 160,000 square miles, including the southern half of Idaho, the southeastern corner of Oregon, and the northern 3/4 of Nevada. It is the largest area in the largest desert area in the United States. Okay. Now, what are some words that they use in this first paragraph here in the purple that I have that help us to describe the Great Basin Desert? Some words that they use are hot summers and freezing winters. We have a wide expanse. Those are some words that help us to describe that desert. Now, our next question says, where in the text does it say that the Great Basin Desert is located to support what we saw on the map? What do you think? In the map, we talked about that it was in Utah, north to Idaho, all the way to Nevada. So this area here talks about our map. And our final question on this slide is, how large is the Great Basin Desert? What did they tell us? How large is it? Find that in your paragraph and then be ready. It says, in all, the Great Basin Desert occupies almost 160,000 square miles. Oh my goodness, that is crazy. Now let's go ahead and let's move on to the second paragraph. I'm going to switch to my green so that we know that we're in that next paragraph. We're going to break this one up sentence by sentence like we did in our last lesson. Now, hopefully, I'm going to pull this up so that you can see this a little more clearly. Every time you see a period, you are going to write a new number. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 periods in this paragraph. So that means I have 6 sentences. Go ahead and number your paragraph sentences and be ready to talk about it. Okay, I'm going to read the very first sentence. The Great Basin Desert is considered cold because it receives most of its precipitation in the form of snow and because it has low average annual temperatures. Now, I want to talk about a few of these words that we saw in our last one. We want to look at precipitation. I'm going to make this a little darker green so that you can see it easier. We need precipitation, we want average, and we want annual. What do those words mean? Now, precipitation, we've talked about this one a lot. Precipitation is the way that rain comes. And typically it says, and right in the next one, it says precipitation in the form of snow. So we know that precipitation can be snow, it can be rain, it can be hail, and it can be sleet. Those are the different forms of precipitation that come down as water forms back down to the earth. When I look at the average, that is what is happening the most often. That is what I can say is typical for that area. And annual means throughout 1 year. So if I have an annual baking competition, it means that it happens once every year about the same time of year. So if I'm talking about annual temperatures, I'm talking about the temperatures for that entire year, and that's how it works. Now, in this, what type of precipitation does the Great Basin Desert receive in the winter? What did it tell us? I want you to look in that first sentence. We are still in the first sentence, so look at that first sentence. What does it tell us? If I read it, I say it receives most of its precipitation in the form of snow. Now, what type of desert does the text say the Great Basin is? In this first sentence, it tells me that it is a cold desert. Now, our next question, what does it say about the temperature of the Great Basin? Go ahead and look at that first sentence one more time. What does it say about the temperatures? It says that we have low average annual temperatures. So we are not getting very hot. Now let's go ahead and move on to the second sentence in the second paragraph. We are going to circle these words before we even get started. We want northernmost, elevations, and exceed. Now, let's read through the sentence and see if we can make sense of what those words are. It is the northernmost desert in the United States and has base elevations that generally exceed 4,000 feet. So if we were to look at a map like we did earlier, we would see that the Great Basin Desert is the furthest north desert in the United States. Now, I know some friends are saying, but what about the Great Plains? Remember, the Great Plains are not exactly a desert. They are what is considered a steppe. They are a frozen tundra sometimes. It is not a desert necessarily. So this is the furthest north desert. That's what northernmost means. Now, looking at the word elevations, I know that I've heard that before, but has elevator. An elevator goes up and down, and it relates to elevation because elevation is how high above sea level something is. So if I am at the beach, there's my water, pretend it's blue. I am at sea level. I have 0 feet of elevation. However, if I go up to the cliff that's up here, I might be at 20 feet elevation, depending on how tall that cliff is. Now, here it says that it exceeds 4,000 feet. When I exceed something, it means that I go above and beyond. So if I were to say it has base elevations that generally go above and beyond 4,000 feet, does that fit? Yeah. So exceed means that it has gone above. So I have my elevations are more than 4,000 feet throughout most of the Great Basin. That's pretty crazy. Now, going ahead and we're going to look at that third sentence. It says, mountain peaks encircled by the Great Basin Desert often exceed 12,000 feet. Now, lucky for us, we talked again about exceed, and we know that exceed means it's higher than or above and beyond in reference when we're talking about elevation. We also circled the word encircled. When we encircle something, it means to surround something. On the map on the next slide that we're going to look at, you're going to see that the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains encircle the Great Basin. The Sierra Nevadas are a mountain range and the Rocky Mountains are a mountain range. So we're going to see how that works. And then finally, we're going to look again at the basin. Remember, a basin, especially when we call it a wash basin, is like a large tub or a large bowl. Now, because the desert is surrounded by high mountains and it has a low elevation in the middle, it looks kind of like a bowl. Let's go ahead and let's look at this picture on the next slide. This area, I'm going to highlight it, the black area in green. This is our Great Basin. Now over to the side here, we have the Wasatch Front. Over here, we have our Sierra Nevada mountains. And in between, we have all of this desert area. Now, if we were to look at this map really closely and with a little more clarity, this is kind of a fuzzy map, we would be able to see that these mountains are a lot taller than where we have our elevation in the middle. All right, let's go ahead and let's move on to this fourth sentence. In Wendover, with an elevation, I read the wrong one. I started on the fifth sentence. On the average, temperatures in the Great Basin are more moderate than those in other deserts. Now, if I were to exchange the word moderate with a word like less extreme, so if I said on the average, temperatures in the Great Basin are less extreme instead of more moderate than those in other deserts, that would still make sense. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's read the fifth and sixth sentence. We'll finish this off. In Wendover, with an elevation of 4,237 feet, summers can record high temperatures over 100 degrees, but generally average about 80 degrees. Average winter temperatures, on the other hand, fall just below freezing. Now, I have a question about that. I'm going to put a question mark right there. What does that mean then about the range of the Great Basin? If I can go all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's pretty high. But if I can go all the way down to freezing, how cold is it when we freeze something? Now, if I remember right, freezing is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that throughout the year, our desert could go all the way from being 32 degrees in January to being 100 degrees by June or by July. So in 6 months, I have a almost 70 degree difference from where I am. How crazy is that? Let's go ahead and move on to the third paragraph. Now you're going to notice I did combine my two pictures, or my two parts of this paragraph, into one picture so that it would be easier for us to read together. Yours will still show that you have, I'll switch to this orange. I believe that this is where yours ends on your next page. But we're going to look at this all together. Now, as I read, make sure you're circling or writing down words that you need to have clarified. Although the Great Basin Desert has fewer plants and animal species than the Mojave Desert, the species found here are well adapted to this unique desert ecosystem. Here, you don't find the variations in cacti or yucca that you find in the Mojave, and you don't find as many native annual plants or native trees and shrubs along riparian areas or washes. But you do find plants and animals that are specific to slight differences in environmental conditions. For example, the sagebrush communities that cover miles and miles of Great Basin landscape include over 10 species of sagebrush, and their distribution corresponds to slight variations in rainfall, temperature, and soil. Where soils become salty, sagebrush gives way to salt-tolerant species like saltbrush. Now, these are some examples of some words that you might have circled or highlighted to give yourself a little bit of a hint. Now, I made sure that I did well adapted, unique, ecosystem, variations, and riparian. I also did native and annual just to remind myself what those two mean. I used corresponds. Now, they wanted me to also talk about distribution, and then finally salt tolerant, which is down here. It's a little harder to see because it's already been highlighted, but it's a little darker right there. Now, when we're talking about something that is well adapted to living somewhere, what does that mean? Think about it for a second. What does it mean to be well adapted? If you said that to make it well adapted, it would have to have adapted to not only survive there, but to live well, right? This is kind of like when we talked about thriving, that when something is well adapted to its ecosystem, it's not only going to live, it's going to thrive. We talked about this word, unique, the other day. Unique means that something is special, kind of one of a kind. It is not seen everywhere. An ecosystem is an environment. It is a kind of place where different things live. We have variations. Those are where we have different kinds of changes or different kinds of things. A variation is where something has different kinds of things to it. When I talk about native plants or native trees, native is another word that means plants or animals that only grow there, kind of like the word endemic. A lot of the plants and animals that we have in the Great Basin are not endemic. They're not so special that they only can grow there. Because really, I mean, you can find sagebrush just about anywhere in Utah, right? So sagebrush is not endemic to the Great Basin, unfortunately. Now, what about this word? Riparian areas or washes. What does riparian mean? I might have to come back to that one later. We'll see. Now, our next ones, we have distribution and corresponds. It says, and their distribution corresponds to slight variations in rainfall. And we're talking about 10 species of sagebrush. When I'm talking about the distribution of sagebrush, I'm talking about how widespread something might be. So I might have some kinds of sagebrush over here, and I have a different kind over here, and another kind over here. And they're all different kinds, and they're distributed to make sure that they can withstand the right amount of rain, the right temperature, and the right soil. Remembering that sometimes that soil becomes salty, and that means that my species have to become salt tolerant, which means that they have to be able to withstand having so much salt in the area. Okay. Any other words that you have? Hopefully we were able to get through them. If you still have any questions, please make sure to contact your teacher and we'll be happy to help. Now, a word that we didn't know was riparian. Riparian means that it is land next to rivers and streams. So let's go back and let's see how we can fit that in. Remember right here. Here you don't find the variations in cacti or yucca that you find in the Mojave, and you don't find as many native annual plants or native trees and shrubs along the land next to rivers and streams or washes. Very interesting. I wonder why we're including rivers and streams when we're talking about a desert. Very interesting. Now, hopefully there were some other words that you saw here that help us to understand a little more. Let's look at these purple questions, though. What does it mean in the text when it says you don't find the variations in cacti or yucca that you find in the Mojave? What does it mean? Now, I think that it must have something to do with the fact that I have shrubs along riparian areas or washes. We don't find the same things, and we don't find all of those things because the Mojave and the Great Basin are two different places, and they're each unique desert ecosystems, which means that they're not going to have the same kinds of plants and animals that everyone does. The next one. What does it mean in the text when it says you don't find as many native annual plants or native trees and shrubs along the riparian areas or washes? We kind of just answered this. It means that we don't have as many plants or animals that are specifically native to this area. They are not technically endemic. They do not only live in this area. Now, going through to the fourth sentence here, it says, for example, and we're right here, the sagebrush communities that cover miles and miles of Great Basin landscape include over 10 species of sagebrush, and their distribution corresponds to slight variations in rainfall, temperature, and soil. Remember, distribution means to spread out, corresponds means to match, and variations means changes. So if I replace these words, so if I say, for example, the sagebrush communities that cover miles and miles of Great Basin landscape include over 10 species of sagebrush, and the way they spread out matches to slight changes in rainfall, temperature, and soil. Did it still make sense the way that I read it the second time? Yeah, that made sense. It made sure that I could understand it a little easier in case someone didn't understand the words that I was using before. Now, in the last sentence, we have where soils become salty, sagebrush gives way to salt-tolerant species like sagebrush. Now, helping myself to figure out what this word means, I know that tolerant means that I can endure something. So a species that is salt tolerant can endure through a lot of salt in the ground, right? So if I have a lot of salt in the ground, a salt tolerant species is going to be able to live through that and do what it needs to do to survive. Now let's go ahead and look at the fourth paragraph. This one is quite small, so it should be easy for us to listen to. Although the Great Basin is a cold desert and the Mojave is a hot desert, plants and animals face similar environmental challenges. In both areas, the plants and animals have to survive with a limited supply of water and through periods of intense heat. Therefore, when you study the plants and animals of these different deserts, you find that many have similar structural and behavioral adaptations. Okay, so if you circled the word intense, part of intense heat, if we talked about structural and behavioral and adaptations, those are some pretty important words in this paragraph. When I'm talking about intense heat, I'm talking about heat that is so hot that you just don't even want to be outside. We're not talking about like, oh, it's 80 degrees, it's a great day to go swimming. I'm talking about, oh my goodness, I need to find some shade because I am boiling in the sun. That is what I mean by intense heat. Now, the structural and behavioral adaptations, that would be talking about the way that the plants or the animals are made and how they behave. So earlier, when we were talking about the Mojave, specifically, we started talking about how jackrabbits and other small mammals behave differently in the desert. They find a small brush of some kind and they sit in the shade of that brush as the sun moves past and provides shade at different angles. So one adaptation that way is that the animals behave a little differently so that they can keep the shade that they've found. A structural similarity, this is how they are made. We might have similar structures in the brush that we find in the Mojave as in the brush that we find in the Great Basin. Even though they're two different kinds of brush, we might have some similarities. Now, what does it say are some similar environmental challenges of plants and animals in a hot and cold desert? Go ahead and pause, think about that and see what you can find. If you said, in both areas, the plants and animals have to survive with a limited supply of waters and through periods of intense heat, you're absolutely right. Those are some similar environmental challenges that both plants and animals in hot and cold deserts both have to deal with. Now let's read this fifth paragraph. I'll go ahead and read it out loud. Make sure that you are circling words as you need. The Great Basin Desert Ecosystems, which is just outside the back door for many of us, invites us to investigate it. For example, in the spring, find the sage grouse and listen to the male's drum. Explore the relationship between sage grouse and sagebrush. Look for the mounds of harvester ants, which sometimes cover up to 15% of some desert areas in northern Utah. And look for spiders, which in some desert shrub communities may include 20 to 40 species. Listen for the Great Basin spadefoot toad, which emerges from its burrow when vibrations of raindrops alert it to the availability of water. And during the day, watch for the western whiptail lizard. Two other reptiles often seen are the Great Basin gopher snake, a non-venomous snake, sometimes called the blow snake, and the Great Basin rattlesnake, the only venomous snake in the area. Finally, always be on the lookout for badgers, antelope, kangaroo rats, kit foxes, bobcats, black-tailed jackrabbits, and coyotes. Now, if you circled any of these words that I highlighted, including investigate, communities, emerges, vibrations, and non-venomous, let's talk about those really quick. To investigate something means to search through it, to find out answers about our questions about it. Like a science investigation, we are looking for answers. We are asking a lot of questions. We're seeing what is special about something. In communities, we said, and look for spiders, which in some desert shrub communities. Now, in a community, what we talk about normally, we live in a really cool community of Tremont. Now, we live in a very small part of community that all comes to North Park Elementary. There are some friends that we have here that came from the community that came from McKinley Elementary. Communities are a small area of people, of plants. It is kind of a condensed area where we have a lot of the similar things. So everyone that is in the community of North Park, we share that, what is the word? We share this area and the things that we have in common because of living in this area. When we talk about the word emerges when it comes to the Great Basin spadefoot toad, this means that it comes out, that it is finally leaving its burrow because of the vibrations of raindrops. Now, if any of you have been in a house that has a metal roof when it's raining really hard outside, you've probably heard the vibrations of the raindrops hitting that roof so hard. The same thing happens for the spadefoot toad when it's in its burrow and the rain comes. Because remember, even though the desert doesn't get a ton of rain all the time, the rain that it does get can be very sudden, and it can come very quickly, very fast, and is very thick, and it can cause flash floods. Now, our last word we have is non-venomous, and it connects to this word down here, which is similar, but just venomous. For something to be venomous, that means that it has a venom or it has poison. So if it's a non-venomous snake, that means that it does not have poison. Now, I want you to look through the last few pieces of this article, this section right here, specifically this paragraph. I want you to find 3 examples from the text of animals that you would find in this Great Basin desert. Hopefully, you saw all of these down here. You could have said the spadefoot toad. We could have talked about, they didn't really tell us a whole lot, but the harvester ants, the sage grouse, the western whiptail lizard, the Great Basin gopher snake, and the Great Basin rattlesnake. We have a lot of examples of animals that we could find in the Great Basin desert. Now that we've read through the whole passage one more time, I want you to come up with a new concluding gist statement that ties together all that we have read and learned. We're going to write it on the bottom of the last page in the margin. So, our sentence frames we have in the end of the gist of this article is, or in conclusion, the article was mostly about. In conclusion, the text was mostly about. You're going to go ahead, write your gist statement that ties up everything that we have read and learned. Now, it might come back to the gist that you started at the beginning. That's okay. But we do want to include a little bit more. We are still going to try to limit it to that 10 to 15 words. You will have to put this into the assignment on Canvas, so make sure that you write this gist right now. Okay, the second part of your assignment on Canvas is to do 2 activities. Your first activity, you are going to find and highlight 5 important sentences from the text that support the main idea you wrote at the bottom of your page. So first, you're going to write your gist from the end. Then you're going to find and highlight those 5 important sentences that support the main idea that you wrote. Now, if we were to ask you later to write a summary of this passage, these sentences should be important enough that you would use them as details in your summary. Now, the next part, so this is question 2. The next part, question 3, you're going to find 5 vocabulary words from the article that were discussed, and you're going to write down their meanings as well. So if you need to go back through the article and find some words that we talked about, you're welcome to do that. If you already have 5 vocabulary words written down on your notebook or on your paper, you can write those ones down as well. Now, the fourth part of your assignment is to tell me 5 animals that live in the Great Basin. This should be pretty easy since we just finished this. But that is your responsibility for today. So first you're going to do your gist. You're going to type in what you wrote at the end of our article. The second thing, you're going to find 5 important sentences from the text that support the main idea that you wrote. Then you're going to find 5 vocabulary words from the article that we discussed, and you're going to write them down and their meanings. Then finally, you're going to find 5 animals that live in the Great Basin based on what we read in the text. Like I said, if you have any questions, please contact your teacher. We would be happy to help, but we can't help if we don't know that you need it. So send us a message, shoot us an email, have your parents call us. We would be happy to assist you in any way that you need. All right, have a good day.